Friends, I want to start today with kind of the lay of the land because we are 21 days, just over 20 days from a presidential election. And if you're Kamala Harris, you're going on Brett Baer's show. Now there's a rumor she's trying to get on Joe Rogan's show. Your internal polling has got to show you have real problems and you don't have a lot of time to fix them. I know you're not prone to doing this, but as I said on Friday, when you plan a campaign, you plan the campaign from Election Day backwards. We now have 3-4 more days this week, all of next week and the week after. By the Saturday before the election, ironically, the Day of the Dead, that is a campaign going on cruise control. But wait, there's more. You have about a week now until the 22nd to finalize anything that's really going to shake up the campaign. Now, in a tied race, and it is technically a tied race, you've got a little more wiggle room. But all of your major advertising needs to be out the door by next Tuesday. Your mail pieces need to be prepared and out the door because God knows when the post office is going to deliver them. Your campaign then needs to set about turning out the vote, maximizing your voter turnout. Democrats still are missing Donald Trump going to California and New York. It had nothing to do with him, had everything to do with saving House seats. He'd like to not to be impeached on day one. But all of the data right now points to momentum being in Donald Trump's favor. Again, before I begin here, this is very important. This is a tied race, technically. It is a tied race. But in being a tied race, the trajectory now points towards a Donald Trump victory and not a Kamala Harris victory. And the reason I can safely say it points to that is because the polling shows a decline in Harris's support, and what that decline comes from are Republican voters who do not like Donald Trump coming home to Donald Trump. Let me just give you the landscape right now. 21 days before the election, 60% of Americans believe the country is headed in the wrong direction. For the first time in 3 decades, more voters identify themselves as Republican than Democrat. Most Americans now believe that they got more benefits from the Trump administration than they are presently getting from the Biden-Harris administration. Donald Trump right now leads Kamala Harris on the economy and inflation, which pollsters treat as separate issues, immigration, and crime. The top 4 issues for voters right now: economy, immigration, inflation, and crime. Donald Trump, in other words, is beating Kamala Harris on all 4 of those issues, and those are the 4 biggest issues voters care about. According to Gallup, 50% of voters believe the Republican Party will make them more prosperous compared to 44% for Democrats. 54% of voters believe the Republicans will keep the country safe from foreign threats compared to only 40% for Democrats. 55% of voters believe the government should do less. 55% of Americans favor less immigration, and a majority favor mass deportation of illegal aliens. More Americans favor Donald Trump to handle Israel and Ukraine appropriately. More Americans have a favorable impression of Donald Trump than Kamala Harris. Y'all, that's the data. That's not me. That's not my opinion. That's the data. That's the data from the Pew poll, from the Gallup poll, from the Ipsos poll, from the NBC poll, from the New York Times poll, the Washington Post poll. You name it. That is the combined data of all the polling out there. That is the polling blueprint for the next 3 weeks. Donald Trump wins on every issue voters care about. Donald Trump has higher favorability than Kamala Harris. Donald Trump's presidential administration favorability now has majority support of the public compared to the Biden-Harris administration. All of those signs point to a race that's not as close as the public polling shows. And not only that, but when you look at the candidates and what they're doing, the internal polling dynamics for Kamala Harris and her campaign right now must not be good. They have gone into full Looney Tunes mode on the Democratic side. You got Barack Obama on the campaign trail lecturing black men that they better get out and support Kamala Harris, which is wild to me that Barack Obama is going out and lecturing black men. And you know, the spin from Democrats, oh, they like to be lectured. I bet they don't. Nothing on the ground is adding up for Kamala Harris right now. If you're Kamala Harris and you're going on Fox News, a network that you don't think is your friend, what are you going for? I'll tell you what you're going for. The narrowing of the polls, the NBC News poll in particular, shows that Kamala Harris is beginning to lose ground with Republican voters who at one point thought they could vote for her. Listen to this from MSNBC.
You're exactly right. The timing of our poll is really instructive here. And when our September poll came out and had Harris with a 5-point lead over Donald Trump, that, of course, was after the debate. It was after a really rough news environment for Donald Trump with the discussion about Springfield, Ohio. And now, all of a sudden, we do show a tied race. And what has occurred is that those soft Republicans, non-MAGA Republicans, have come back home to Trump. In our September poll, they were lagging, obviously, after the debate, after the discussion of Springfield, Ohio. Our poll finds them that they are back with Trump, and that explains him going from 44% in our poll in September now to 48%. But, Joe, you ended up mentioning the things that Harris has to work on with shoring up Latino voters, getting African Americans in the fold, white women. Our poll ends up having a really big gender gap where Harris has a 14-point lead among female voters, while Donald Trump has a 16-point lead among male voters. That's overall a 30-point net gender gap. And what is kind of fascinating is that Trump's lead with men is slightly larger than Harris's lead with women. And if her ability to get back in a lead, national lead over Trump is being able to have a bigger lead among women than Trump's lead among men. And so a lot of those demographics, this is the last 3 weeks of the race. This is why you end up having mobilization and campaign to be able to juice your turnout, to shore up your weaknesses. And we're going to see what both campaigns have up their sleeves over the next 3 weeks.
You know, again, if she's losing men by a wider margin than she's losing women, women tend to turn out more than men. But in a presidential race, there can be parity. And Kamala Harris is not doing well among married women. This oftentimes gets missed by the press corps. Donald Trump and Mitt Romney both won married women, not women overall. A lot of single women out there who vote, but among married women, they did well. And Donald Trump is doing well with married women again this time against Kamala Harris. And then you've got, of course, Donald Trump and black voters. Here's Harry Inton over at CNN.
I mean, the bottom line is this. At this particular hour, if you believe the polling, Donald Trump's going to put up the best performance with black voters since Richard Nixon back in 1960. Not 68, since 1960. That's 64 years ago. Among Hispanic voters, Donald Trump's going to put up the best performance for Republicans since 2004 and George W. Bush.
Now, this is notable because listen to the conversation among Democrats. John Heilemann on MSNBC this morning.
Is that the Harris campaign finally allowed David Plouffe to go out and try to talk about the data on both Dan Pfeiffer's podcast on Pod Save America and in New York Magazine yesterday. And I will tell you that David Plouffe is, he's a partisan and he fights for his team. But he is not a BSer. And if you read his assessment of the data, it is, I think, as clear, as both sophisticated and clear-eyed as anything anybody could say. And the two campaigns do not disagree about this. And what Plouffe basically says is, if you see a poll that has Harris up by 4 points, throw it in the trash. If you see a poll that has Trump up by 4 points, throw it in the trash. It's a tie race. This is uncomfortable for Democrats. It's a tie race. It's going to be a tied race all the way through to Election Day. It's going to be maybe the closest election of our lifetimes. Everyone is going to be scared if they care about the future of the country.
Again, I don't know that the data shows it's a tied race, and I tend to trust the data and the polling average. I don't trust the individual polls, and I know you guys don't trust the polls, but the polling averages historically are pretty good, and they show a tied race. But when you look at the tied race and you look at how Donald Trump in all the tied race data still performs overwhelmingly well. I get that there's a dislike of Donald Trump, and any other Republican would probably be blowing it out of the water right now. But at the same time, I do wonder if the dislike of Trump is keeping some people from saying they're actually voting for Trump, even though they actually are. Like in 2016, where Donald Trump overperformed his polling. And in 2020, Donald Trump overperformed his polling. And in a tied race, I think that benefits Donald Trump. The fact that the Democrats are in this level of panic right now, you have Barack Obama lecturing black men. You have Kamala Harris going to Fox News and possibly Joe Rogan. You have Kamala Harris now sitting for more interviews. They've taken the bubble wrap off of her. While Donald Trump is going to California, New York, he's had multiple visits in Pennsylvania. The Democrats are maligning his rally in Pennsylvania, claiming he wandered around the stage for 45 minutes listening to music, pay no attention to the medical emergencies happening in the crowd. You've got CBS News and the other networks in full meltdown mode, going all neo-Nazi, racist, misogynist. Donald Trump is going to get you killed. Where's the joy? Where is the joy? This is not a joyful campaign. I'll tell you where the joy is. Joy Reid on MSNBC having a not quite normal vision of the future.
With these claims that Trump is surging with black and Latino voters and leading in every single swing state, according to secret internal polls, despite all the Hitler talk. Yes, this race will be far too close. Because unfortunately, we do have a fascist groundswell in parts of this country, mainly among white men, let's be clear, but in small pockets among black and brown men, too. This happens to be a global phenomenon as women become more economically independent and seek positions of power.
You got that? Yeah, because women are economically independent now. The men are turning fascist, and it's black men, too. That's why this is a tied race. That's not the joyful vibe of a winning campaign team. And I will tell you, privately, Democrats are bemoaning the fact that Kamala Harris is not gaining upward momentum. She's declining among key demographic groups she needs. This is why you're beginning to see a Democratic meltdown out there, and why her partisans are out there rushing to say, no, guys, it's really a tied race. It's really a tied race. It shouldn't be a tied race for Kamala Harris, because Donald Trump is disliked by a majority of Americans who say they're going to show up and vote, and yet they're still willing to vote for him. This has all the feelings of the end of the John Kerry campaign in 2004, where some of his aides were still super upbeat, but the reality was everyone in the press and the Democratic Party began to recognize he was not going to cross the finish line. And the panic and backbiting was starting 3 weeks before the election. We are 3 weeks before this election, and the panic and backbiting is starting in the Harris campaign. You do not hear people within the Trump campaign maligning each other, attacking each other, and blaming each other. That's coming from the Harris campaign, and that's what losing campaigns do. 3 weeks before the election, her team are acting like losers. In fact, her team is acting like Donald Trump is winning, and Donald Trump's team is acting like they're winning, and all of that is shifting the vibe. Harris claims she was surfing to victory.